Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you all can hear me okay. My name is Caitlin Goodman. I'm one of the Special Collections Coordinators at the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm joined by Joseph Shemtov, who's the library's Special Collections Coordinator for Outreach, and Laura Strofolino, who's the curator of the Print and Picture Collection. So we've really enjoyed being a part of Wawa Welcome America's Free Museum Day for the past few years. And we're also really excited that you've come to join us here to this Crowdcast to keep things going. So today's program will start with an introduction to our Special Collections Division, and then I'll give you a virtual tour of the Rare Book Department, where I'm curator, before passing the mic off to Joe to give a talk about our Revolutionary War era prints. Then Laura will introduce you to the Print and Picture Collection and tell you a little bit about Philadelphia's long history of celebrating our history. We're aiming to have time at the end to answer your questions, so please feel free to send them directly via the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen, or just chime in during the chat, and then we can do questions at the end. So let's get started. The Special Collections Division of the Free Library of Philadelphia is the special collections of the Philadelphia Municipal Library System. So there's history all over the Free Library. Many of the neighborhood locations have their own local history materials, but all of the formal special collections are in the main branch, which is the Parkway Central Library. The special collections include the Children's Literature Research Collection, with more than 85,000 children's books published from 1837 to today, with a special emphasis on the Pennsylvania region, along with thousands of pieces of original art and papers by children's books, authors, and illustrators. The map collection is especially strong on Philadelphia and Pennsylvania maps, and there's a lot digitized on the Free Library's digital collections, but it includes more than 130,000 items from all over the world. There are also a number of music special collections. The Fleischer Collection of Orchestral Music is the largest lending library of orchestra performance materials in the world, but there are also collections of chamber music, choral music, and sheet music for patrons to check out. With us today is Laura Strofolino, the curator of the Print and Picture Collection, which includes fine art prints, photographs, original drawings, artist books, and historic images of Philadelphia. And I'm the curator of the Rare Book Department, which is one of the largest in an American public library. You'll hear more about us in a minute. The theater collection includes theater, of course, but also early film history and popular entertainments like circus arts. Local playbills in the collection date back to 1803. And finally, the Rosenbach has been a part of the Free Library since 2013. It is a separate museum and historic house located about a mile from the Parkway Central Library, and it has wonderful collections of rare books, manuscripts, Americana, and art. So the reason all these collections exist is to be a resource for all Philadelphians. We host public programs, welcome individual researchers, and offer a wide variety of hands-on and interpretive classes. While we can't welcome you into our rooms today, we hope to pique your curiosity to visit us in person again. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the Rare Book Department specifically. We've been around since 1949 and have been doing daily tours since then. So I thought it might be nice to frame this virtual tour to address some of our most frequently asked questions. But of course, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at the end of the program. So, what is a rare book anyway? Well, it depends. That's a lame answer, I know, but first of all, a book has to be in demand to be rare. If nobody wants it, that means nobody wants it. But beyond that, there are a number of categories, including importance. It can be important content, like the kinds of things people think about as being history. This, for example, is a first edition of Frederick Douglass's 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. We also consider scarcity. Frederick Douglass, for example, was a best-selling writer. There are a lot of copies of his books still around, even first editions. But here's Edgar Allan Poe's first book, Tamerlane. He was not a best-selling writer, at least not when he was alive. Maybe 50 copies were printed in 1827. Today, only 12 are known to survive. So the one we have is quite scarce. And of course, age. This is one of our medieval European manuscripts, which is famous for being especially fancy. It's around 800 years old, and it was made in Paris around 1225, which brings us to another great question. What is your oldest book? Okay, so this one is also an it depends. It depends on what you mean by book. We have some of the earliest human writing with thousands of cuneiform tablets, some of which are over 4,000 years old. But if clay tablets don't seem like books to you, we also have this ancient Egyptian papyrus. It's from around 800 BCE. Or maybe you meant oldest codices, which is the fancy term for book-shaped books. We have single pages from the 9th century. The one on the left is from England, written in Anglo-Saxon, one of the ancestors of the English language. The one to the right is a page from a Quran that was copied in Iraq. Both of those are manuscripts, which means they were written by hand. If you want to limit it to printed books, we have a lot of incunables, another fancy term for Western printed books using movable type between 1450 and 1500. Gutenberg's Bible is probably the most famous. And an important note about printed books. They were invented and refined in China and Korea centuries before Gutenberg was a sparkle in his mother's eye. What is your most valuable book? Well, there are a lot of different kinds of value. One kind of rare book value is historical. So here's a timely example. Philadelphia's yellow fever epidemic of 1793. This pamphlet about the epidemic was written by prolific Philadelphia publisher and civic bigwig Matthew Carey, who was a member of the city's health committee. The handwritten bit, by the way, is from another Philadelphian's experience with the disease. Carey's pamphlet was majorly influential and went through several printings and editions just in the first months when it was published. But Carey made a number of wild claims in the pamphlet, including that Black people were immune to the yellow fever and were profiting off of their nursing work. This was quite the claim from health committee member Carey, who responded to the pandemic by fleeing the city. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, two Black Philadelphians who founded the mutual aid Free African Society, wrote their own pamphlet in response. And of course, Philadelphia history isn't just in the past. Here's a much more contemporary protest piece. The Re-Entry Bill of Rights, a demand for restorative justice, printed on paper, handmade from shredded criminal records, that was co-authored by more than 1,000 Philadelphians with criminal records. In many ways, value just isn't a very meaningful category for a public library rare book collection. That's not to say, of course, that we don't have our celebrity objects, like the 1623 First Folio of Shakespeare, with notes handwritten by fellow English poet John Milton. Is it online? Well, we do digitize things carefully and put images up online. Although the process is more complicated with rare books than scanning files on an office copier, it is still one of the most effective ways to make our collections accessible to people who can't visit us in person. But we also really like to encourage an experience with the book as a physical object. A digital surrogate of an object is always something of a translation. And things can be lost in translation. These books are a lot bigger or smaller than you might have expected. What's your favorite book? Well, everyone I work with will have a different answer. For me, it depends on what I'm working on. I love this anthology of Persian language, poetry, and prose that was completed in Kashmir in 1805. A correction by the scribe in Hebrew suggests his own invisible backstory, and a note in English by a later British owner who, quote, removed it from Lucknow Palace Library in 1858, end quote, hides what was, in fact, the looting of British soldiers during the capture of Lucknow. And one of our MVPs on our public tour is this 1864 Latin book for schoolboys. But clearly, no one is excited by its insides. This is called a disappearing four-edge painting, and we have dozens of examples of these little surprises. So, what are these books good for? Well, a book is a specific object that, given time and opportunity, tells its own stories. Take this little paperback. It's writer Amiri Baraka's first book of poetry, published in 1961 under his birth name, Leroy Jones. It wasn't until 1968 that he changed his name, which tells us something about the early life of this book, with Leroy Jones on the cover and Amiri Baraka signed inside. And plenty of the stories books tell come from the people who owned them. This is a 1771 copy of a popular children's lesson book, the New England Primer. Of course, in 1771, America was a British colony, and the portrait you see there is one of King George III. But that didn't stop the book's owner from scribbling out the king's name and dedication and writing in their own praise for George Washington. Or look at Common Sense, another pamphlet that has built up some big history. Thomas Paine wrote it to provoke support for the American Revolution. He sharply criticized King George, here calling him an inveterate enemy to liberty and rejecting his thirst for arbitrary power. The pamphlet was a sensation. In fact, it was republished in England a few months later. Unsurprisingly, the English publisher made a few changes for his new audience, redacting the insults to King George entirely. So, what are these books for? Well, they're for you. We hope you'll come find some more stories. Thank you for spending some time with me today. Please do reach out to us if you'd like to learn more about what we have and what you can do with it. Now I'd like to turn things over to Joseph Shemtov, who's going to be talking a little bit about some of our Revolutionary War era engravings in the rare book department.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was a great presentation. My name is Joe Shemtov. I am a special collections librarian. And what better way to celebrate American Independence Week than by exploring the American Revolutionary engravings donated to the Free Library in 1947 by William McIntyre Elkins. So let's take a look. The collection of 18 copper engravings includes prints by popular engravers such as Paul Revere and others by unknown or not so popular engravers. They hang on a wall in the William Elkins room in the Rare Book Department of the Free Library, just as they hung on the walls of the homes of American patriots. All are welcome to view them in person during our tours or online anytime. American patriots experienced the Revolution by reading printed publications and viewing images of battles and portraits of war heroes. Many of these images were sold as prints and were then hand painted. This print, entitled Ye Baffled Britons, the Capture of Major Andre, was engraved by Samuel Blythe, a Salem engraver. Major Andre was a highly regarded British officer and sole intermediary between the British and German, and General Benedict Arnold. Sorry about that. We see him here dressed in red, trying to bribe Patriot soldiers dressed in blue into letting him free. Andre was arrested for collaborating with Benedict Arnold and eventually hanged as a spy for attempting to turn over the American fortress at West Point to the British. The text below is a poem that reinforces British corruption. Printing and selling engravings was above all a business, and prints of George Washington were top sellers. He was a hero among colonists long before he became the country's first president in 1789. He was a symbol of unity, strength of character, and leadership during the Revolutionary War and in the years that followed. Washington was a hero in the eyes of American patriots, but how do we see Washington today when we look at these engravings? So we know Washington didn't live up to the ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence he signed, which stated, among other things, that all men are created equal. Although he was anti-slavery, he owned hundreds of enslaved people. In fact, his enslaved people were only released after his death. As president, he may have supported abolition, but his primary objective was to appease Southern slave-owning states into joining the Union. And while he lived in Philadelphia, Washington found creative ways to circumvent the Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Act that automatically freed slaves 28 years and older who moved to this state and lived there for more than 6 months. He did this by rotating his slaves living in Philadelphia before they reached the 6 month mark. Also, it was in Philadelphia that Oni Judge Staines and Hercules' Uncle Harkless Posey escaped from Washington, and that Washington tried unsuccessfully to recapture them. This engraving, titled The True Portraiture of His Excellency George Washington, portrays Washington in 16th century Roman armor. Roman dress symbolized military strength. While the British surrender in Yorktown did not officially end the war because the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, most Americans consider the British surrender in Yorktown as the last major engagement of the American Revolution. This engraving, titled Lord Cornwallis Surrendering His Sword to General Washington, is totally misleading. Cornwallis is not depicted in the engraving, and Washington did not accept the sword of surrender. As the story goes, Cornwallis claimed he was sick and sent Charles O'Hara, pictured here, to deliver the symbolic sword to Washington. Sensing he would be snubbed, Washington appointed General Benjamin Lincoln, seen on the right, to accept the sword of surrender instead of him. But Washington is still present as he stands in the middle between O'Hara and Benjamin Lincoln. We're familiar with Paul Revere as a member of the Sons of Liberty, the militant organization that fought for the rights of Americans and against the abuses of the British government. Some may also know that Revere made a living as a silversmith and even as a part-time dentist. But we forget that he also made a living as an engraver. His most famous engraving, and maybe the most iconic image of the American Revolution, is the Bloody Massacre, more commonly known as the Boston Massacre. The engraving commemorates one of the most important events leading up to the American Revolution. It depicts the incident that occurred on March 5th, 1770, when a belligerent mob of angry Bostonians confronted British soldiers in protest of a series of unfair tax legislation levied upon them by the British. British soldiers responded by firing into the crowd of protesters, killing 5. Revere's print was printed only 3 weeks after the event took place. Revere's Bloody Massacre was extremely popular. About 400 were printed and about 200 survived, primarily because colonists cared for them dearly. This is evidenced by the fact that Bostonians paid a higher price for them and often bought them already framed to protect them. In fact, it is estimated that about half of the impressions that survive are either in their original frames or in frames of the period, such as our copy, which is in its original frame. Part of Revere's success lay in his ability to engrave, publish, and sell prints quickly, following incidents as they occurred. In the case of the Bloody Massacre, he was able to do this by copying the design of his friend Henry Pelham, whom he did not bother to credit or compensate. On the right is the New York Public Library's copy of Pelham's engraving, Fruits of Arbitrary Power. It depicts the horror of the Boston Massacre. Note the similarities. Revere copied his friend's design with modifications and published it a week before he did. The Boston Massacre is widely acknowledged as the earliest form of American propaganda. Through this print, Revere intended to incite anger among colonists and to provoke them into taking up arms against the British. In order to really appreciate this engraving, we must look more closely at the images, just like the Patriots did when this picture hung on their walls. Here, we do not see the belligerent mob of hundreds of people attacking and angry, provoking British troops, as we know was the case. Instead, Revere depicts a small and defenseless gathering of Bostonians randomly and mercilessly shot by the British without provocation. We see a woman crying, a man stopping a bullet with his hand. On the bottom left is Crispus Attucks, a Black man and Native American shot dead by the British. He would later be championed by the abolitionist movement for his heroic role in the American Revolution. We even see a gentle dog, a symbol of innocence and loyalty, facing the British, waiting to be shot. Firing on these helpless people are the British, dressed in red, matching the red blood spilled throughout. They are lined up, shooting innocent people after the officer strikes his sword, commanding the soldiers to fire. The message is clear. British soldiers are the aggressors and were ordered to shoot innocent and defenseless people. Some soldiers appear to be having fun, like the one on the far left. Above the soldiers, on the building, we see the sign, the butcher's house, above the customs house. This was another visual ploy by Revere to portray the British as bloodthirsty for their unfair taxation practices. Finally, if these provocative images were not enough, Revere adds incendiary text below, condemning the British for massacring innocent civilians with a detailed account of the scenes as he wanted them remembered, naming each of the civilians who were massacred and whose blood was unnecessarily shed. As history bears, the British soldiers were put on trial. John Adams, our second president, defended them. All were found innocent, acting in self-defense against a threatening mob of over 100 people, except for two who were found guilty of manslaughter and were branded on the hand as punishment. The Boston Massacre event, as portrayed in Revere's engraving, continued to be commemorated every year as a rallying call to arms against the ruthless British, up until the revolution took place 5 years later. As we look at this engraving today, many questions pop up. How is violence necessary or part of our American fabric today? What is the responsibility of our media today in reporting events? Thank you so much for listening to me. And now I present you Laura Stroffolini.
Thank you, Joe. I'll be giving a brief introduction to the print and picture collection, and then I'll talk about Independence Day and how Philadelphia has celebrated it over the years, including 3 big anniversaries in 1876, 1926, and 1976. The print and picture collection, which we call PICS for short, is home to a variety of collections of prints, photos, drawings, posters, artist books, and historical images of Philadelphia. PICS has a staff of 1 curator, that's me, 1 library assistant, and a handful of dedicated volunteers. We work to create tools to help you find what you're looking for. We select material to add to our digital collections. We answer reference questions and invite researchers by appointment. We host class visits and programs from elementary age to lifelong learners. We work on exhibitions throughout Parkway Central Library. You can find us on social media, visit our website, and email us to get in touch. When we are open again, please give us a call and come visit us in Parkway Central Library. So let's talk about Independence Day. Independence Day is the United States annual celebration of nationhood. It commemorates the passage of the Declaration of Independence by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776 in the Pennsylvania State House, located between 5th and 6th Streets on Chestnut Street.
This is the earliest known representation of the State House, seen here in 1752, not 1750 like it says, in a reprint of Skull and Heap's famous map of Philadelphia. Over time, the State House became known as Independence Hall. On July 8, 1776, the first public readings of the Declaration of Independence were held in Independence Square to the ringing of bells and band music. The next year, on July 4, 1777, Congress was adjourned and Independence Day was celebrated with bonfires, bells, and fireworks. These two prints, based on paintings by John Lewis Krimmel, show celebrations at Center Square, the former site of the city's waterworks, and the current site of Philadelphia City Hall. Here's an 1851 July 4th firework display at Broad and Market from a clipping in the Kastner scrapbooks, a 47-volume set on Philadelphia history. The words above the arches say, July 4th, 1776, Liberty and Union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Celebrating American independence when not all people in America had independence is a reminder of the Declaration's hypocrisy about liberty. When slaves were freed in New York State on July 4, 1827, African Americans celebrated the next day, July 5th. In 1832, Peter Osborne addressed the African Church in New Haven, Connecticut. On account of the misfortune of our color, our 4th of July comes on the 5th, but I hope and trust that when the Declaration of Independence is fully executed, which declares that all men, without respect of person, were born free and equal, we may then have our 4th of July on the 4th. When Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery in 1838, was asked to speak to the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester, New York on Independence Day, 1852, he chose July 5th for the day of his address. The words of his speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," include, "The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. This 4th July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." You can find the full text of the speech in ebooks available through freelibrary.org. By the 1870s, the 4th of July was the most important secular holiday on the calendar. Congress passed a law making Independence Day a federal holiday on June 28, 1870. On March 3, 1871, in preparation for the 100th anniversary of the passage of the Declaration of Independence, an act of Congress provided for a World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876. The International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine, or in a less wordy way, the Centennial Exhibition, opened on May 10, 1876, on a 285-acre tract of Fairmount Park overlooking the Schuylkill River. The fairgrounds were designed almost exclusively by 27-year-old German immigrant Hermann J. Schwartzman. This balloon view is a hand-colored wood engraving for Harper's Weekly. If you visit the Centennial Exhibition digital collection at freelibrary.org/digital, you can really zoom in on the image and see the labels for each building and street name. The grounds included Memorial Hall, which was designed as a permanent monument to the Centennial. The building is now the home of the Please Touch Museum. And the main exhibition building, where 13,720 exhibitors from over 27 countries displayed their manufactures like furniture, clocks, and tools. The opening ceremonies took place on the terraces of Memorial Hall and in the area facing the main building. Speaker stands were erected in front of Memorial Hall, and stands for a great choir and orchestra were placed directly opposite before the entrance of the main building. President Ulysses S. Grant and other dignitaries spoke to the crowds of over 150,000 people. Frederick Douglass was invited to sit with the president, but was not invited to speak. In fact, he was almost denied entrance to the platform by police who refused to honor his ticket, incredulous that a Black man would be welcome in the company of the president. After a senator intervened, he reached the platform and was loudly cheered. This is one of over 1,100 photographs in our collection by the Centennial Photographic Company, which held the sole license for photography issued by the Centennial Commission. The photos range in size. This one is 13 inches by 16 inches. All of the CPC photographs are silver albumin prints created on site and a complex and cumbersome process that required lots of supplies, equipment, and manpower. It's hard to see the details in this virtual presentation, but if you spend some time looking at the digital collection, you'll be surprised what you can find when you zoom in. Take a look at these 4 spots. It's hard to make out what's going on at this size. But when you zoom in, you can see a conductor and others on top of a full trolley car, the platform, which probably holds President Grant and Frederick Douglass, a spectator standing on top of a road roller for a better view, and the Centennial Photographic Company set up to take a different photo. During the Centennial exhibition, the 100th anniversary of the passage of the Declaration of Independence was celebrated at Independence Hall with ceremonies featuring a reading of the document by a descendant of an original signer. This wasn't the only declaration read that day. The National Woman Suffrage Association, having been denied permission to be part of the official centennial ceremony, printed and distributed copies of their Declaration of Rights for Women. When leader Susan B. Anthony spotted an unoccupied bandstand, she stepped up and read the declaration to a large crowd. We protest before the assembled nations of the world against the centennial celebration as an occasion for national rejoicing, as only through equal, impartial suffrage can a genuine Republican form of government be realized. And here are some centennial highlights. The Corliss Centennial steam engine in Machinery Hall provided power to exhibitors throughout the exhibition. Because George Corliss would not allow his engines to be operated on Sundays, the Centennial was only open 6 days a week. The arm and hand of Bartholdi's Liberty Enlightening the World arrived at the Centennial in August. Visitors could climb up to the balcony of the torch to view the fairground. 10 years later, the completed Statue of Liberty was dedicated in New York Harbor. Admission to the Centennial was 50 cents. The largest single-day attendance was Pennsylvania Day on Thursday, September 28th. This photo shows the crowd in front of the Pennsylvania Building on that day. In the 6 months before opening day, May 10th, and closing day, November 10th, nearly 10 million people visited to help celebrate the United States Centennial. Now we'll fast forward 50 years to the SESQUI-CENTENNIAL International Exposition of 1926. PIX has almost 3,000 items related to the celebration of 150 years of American independence, including 24 volumes of photographs by John Cardinal, the official photographer of the exposition. Only about 300 of the items are scanned, which means I'm not able to virtually give you a full picture of the event, so I'll just share a few images from our digital collection. The idea for a sesquicentennial was suggested by Philadelphia businessman John Wanamaker in 1916. Wanamaker served on the Centennial Board of Finance and hoped the city would host another World's Fair on the site of the new Fairmount Parkway, now Benjamin Franklin Parkway. In 1924, with corruption rampant in the city, the newly elected mayor, Freeland Kendrick, in an act of political patronage, changed the location to a swampy area of South Philadelphia known as the Neck. The lack of planning time and poor building conditions did not bode well for the success of the fair. Here are 2 images showing the fairgrounds just 1 year before the exposition was to start. And in the next pictures, we can see 1 year later, the unfinished roads and buildings that were that still weren't finished before opening day. Straddling Broad Street, just above the fair's entrance on Packer Avenue, was an 80-foot-high replica of the Liberty Bell with 26,000 15-watt light bulbs. The vertical road in the center of this map is Broad Street. At the bottom is the giant Liberty Bell. At the top is the Navy Yard. That horseshoe design in the upper left was SESQUI-CENTENNIAL Stadium, later known as JFK Stadium. As part of the SESQUI-CENTENNIal, Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney fought the Boxing World's Heavyweight Championship in front of a crowd of over 120,000 people. We have 24 vendor booth photos scanned showing Wilbur chocolates, Hires root beer, several near beer vendors, and more. The near beer vendors are a reminder that the sesquicentennial took place during Prohibition. This photo of the Breyers ice cream booth is one of my favorites. The delicious, nutritious ice cream sandwiches were only 10 cents. We'll leave the SESQUI-CENTENNIAL behind with a bang. Here are fireworks over the lagoon. And we'll fast forward again to the United States Bicentennial of 1976. I used to think that this Dixie cup and a few folders of material were all we had related to the 1976 Bicentennial celebrations, but we recently unearthed a 12-volume set of Bicentennial scrapbooks, seen here on this cart. The scrapbooks were created by Sidney W. Hay, who donated the volumes to the library in 1977. Mr. Hay spent 14 months compiling the material from 3 of Philadelphia's daily newspapers, the Bulletin, Inquirer, and Daily News, and the material fills nearly 3,000 pages. Since we only recently rediscovered the scrapbooks, none of them have been digitized, so we just have iPhone snapshots. On the left is the cover of Volume 1, on the right, an open page spread. Since Mr. Hay only started the scrapbooks in late 1975, they don't show the full picture of the drama behind planning a bicentennial. They only capture the events of the bicentennial year, 1976. This 1964 booklet from the City Planning Commission shows plans for aerial cable cars from Convention Hall to the Art Museum to the zoo to the planned exhibition grounds in Fairmount Park. A group of young professionals proposing a much larger bicentennial plan conflicted with the City Planning Commission. Another initiative wanted to make sure minority voices were included in the planning. Without support and funding from the federal government, bicentennial plans in Philadelphia were scaled down, and smaller celebrations of the bicentennial were held throughout the United States. The American Way Festival took place on May 11, 1975, to coincide with the 200th anniversary of the convening of the Second Continental Congress and to serve as an opening event for the upcoming bicentennial. The festival featured music, dance, sports, arts and crafts, parades, fireworks, and more, and the headline act was Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The first pages of Mr. Hay's scrapbook start with the plan to ring in the year 1976 with a physical move of the Liberty Bell from Independence Hall to the new Liberty Bell Pavilion. The bell was moved again to the Liberty Bell Center in 2003. A lot of clippings in the scrapbooks include negative opinions on the bicentennial planning and the commercialism surrounding it. The caption for this Tony Auth cartoon from the Inquirer says, "In what other country are the people free enough to do this to their bicentennial?" Items for sale in the shop include a flag-themed toilet seat, spirits of 76, and a special patriotic White House tape deck. Leading up to the bicentennial, Mayor Frank Rizzo, having increased taxes just after being elected in 1975, was facing a recall by opponents. At the same time, Rizzo told the press that if federal and state authorities didn't send 15,000 troops to maintain order during the bicentennial celebration, the quote, blood is on their hands. Who were these radicals that worried Rizzo? One group was called Rich Off Our Backs. The Rich Off Our Backs Coalition, whose slogan was, "We've carried the rich for 200 years, let's get them off our backs," did demonstrate during the bicentennial, while all demonstrations were peaceful. But Rizzo's hysterical warning of bloodshed kept many visitors from visiting Philadelphia. Celebrities and dignitaries did honor Philadelphia's role in the bicentennial throughout 1976. Princess Grace was a judge in the flower show. Elton John played 3 nights at the Spectrum, and Frank Rizzo declared July 7th to be Elton John Day in Philadelphia. Hank Aaron and President Gerald Ford watched the Major League Baseball All-Star Game at Veterans Stadium. Reverend Jesse Jackson gave a sermon on Independence Mall as part of an interfaith group service on Independence Day. Many public works of art were installed in honor of the bicentennial, including Robert Indiana's Love Statue and Jacques Lipschitz's Government of the People. Shown here are Klaus Oldenburg's Clothespin at Center Square, John W. Rodin's Nasica at the newly opened African American Museum at 7th and Arch, and a colorful orange banner designed by Alexander Calder. The banner is one of the Calder banners that now belong to the Free Library. We'll wrap up our tour of Philadelphia celebrations in the print and picture collection here. Something to keep in mind is that the 250th anniversary of the passage of the Declaration of Independence in 2026 is just 6 years away. An organization called Philadelphia 250 is already underway coordinating efforts to commemorate the anniversary. Maybe they can draw inspiration and learn lessons from our previous celebrations. And we thank you so much for joining us today. Joe, Caitlin, and I have some time to answer questions if there are any in the chat, and I guess we'll take a look now.
Thank you, Laura, for that. I do want to start things off because I'd love to hear more about the man who created those scrap. You said there were 12 volumes of scrapbooks, which is quite a lot of time to spend for the 1976 Bicentennial. Clearly, it's #1 fan. Do you know anything more about him?
I do. So Mr. Hay spent 2,000 hours, which I believe is the equivalent of a full-time job, while he already had a full-time job working on putting those scrapbooks together. His full-time job was at a certified public accountants called Haskins and Sells. And he oversaw, he had a background in secretarial work, and he oversaw a department of people who put together reports. And he was also assigned to put together a quarterly newsletter for the department. And while he was making the newsletter, he was doing all these clippings, and he thought, I might as well save these and put them in these scrapbooks. The scrapbooks have information. I mean, you could see in some of the pictures, you could see the stickers. I'm not sure where the stickers came from, the colorful flower stickers. There's Uncle Sam. There's all kinds of stickers throughout. And the scrapbooks also, he describes the kind of tape they used, the methods they used. It's really fascinating.
That's awesome. I love the dedication he had to it. And there are a couple questions that have come in, but, please keep them coming. So here's a question that I will read aloud. I heard you have Dickens's bird on whom Poe based The Raven. May we see him, please? And the short answer is, I don't know how to give you, like, I'm in my house. I'm working from home right now. I don't know how to give you a vision of Grip. That is her name. So Grip is a female bird. She is the raven. She did belong to Charles Dickens, so you really have all of your facts straight. And it is widely believed, sort of generally understood, that this bird did in fact inspire Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So sort of the short story is that Charles Dickens really loved animals. He had a wide variety of pets, one of whom was a pet raven that he was given in order to help do some research for some stories that he was writing. One of those books was Barnaby Rudge, which tends not to be as widely read today as some of the other classics. But in the book, there is a character, Grip, the Raven. And Grip the Raven in the book gives advice and suggestions to the main character, Barnaby Rudge, and is sort of a voice on his shoulder. And Edgar Allan Poe, who made a little bit of a living as a literary critic, did a review of Barnaby Rudge. And in the review, he overall liked the book, but had a few complaints. Some of them were, the Raven could have been used to better effect. This is such a mythologically significant character. And then, lo and behold, a few years later, published The Raven. With the passage of time, Grip the Raven, the physical bird, died. Charles Dickens had him stuffed. She lived on Charles Dickens's mantle for a while. After his death, his possessions were sold off. She entered the auction market and then eventually made her way to America, was purchased by a collector who loved both Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe. And then upon his death, Richard Gimble, so some of you might recognize the Gimble's department stores. Upon his death, he gave his Poe collection and then also Grip the Raven to us at the Free Library. When the Rare Book Department is back open again, I really do encourage you to come. We have her installed at the end of our hallway. You cannot miss her if you make her way there. And also, we've named our Twitter account in her honor, Grip the Raven. Thank you to Janine. She has put in the chat the link to our digital collection, so you can see a beautiful photo of Grip.
I did not know that Grip was a female. Thank you.
Yes, I'm so sorry. The best part of the story is we learned recently that Grip was a female when the Raven Master at the Tower of London who's one of the beefeaters in charge of keeping the ravens, came and he sexed the bird, which is, I believe, the technical term of diagnosing whether the bird is male or female. And he said, no, that is a female raven. So
That's awesome.
definitely, I know a lot more about books than I know taxidermied ravens. So thank you for that question. And then here's a question. We will give it to Laura. What exciting new things did you learn preparing for this talk?
I had heard that about the SESQUI-CENTENNIal and that it was a failure, but I didn't know why it was such a failure. I just thought maybe it was the time. I didn't realize that they had these great plans, or that they had already developed plans for the Parkway, and then switched it, with less than, about 2 years before it was slated to be open. I didn't know about that. I didn't know about the boxing match. I thought that was pretty cool. I was looking online, and I think I even found a YouTube video of the boxing match from 1926, which is just incredible because YouTube wasn't around then. Sorry. But so, I learned a lot.
I think the thing that I was most surprised to learn when I was putting it together was I knew a little bit about the yellow fever epidemic here in Philadelphia, but going really into the primary sources was the first time I realized Matthew Carey, who again wrote a ton about the yellow fever and was always chiming in with his thoughts and opinions, along with Benjamin Rush and many others. But that Matthew Carey, like many Philadelphians of means, fled the city. Benjamin Rush was a physician who did not flee the city and helped take care of people afflicted with the yellow fever, as did Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who I referred to in the presentation. But Matthew Carey headed for the hills, which I thought was sort of funny. Joe, do you have anything that you learned preparing for this talk?
Yeah, definitely. I think what I didn't know, and I'm ignorant on, I'm ashamed for admitting it, but I wasn't familiar with the Pennsylvania Gradual Abolition Act that freed enslaved people if they were in Pennsylvania after 6 months. So I didn't know about that law, and I didn't know that Washington was switching out his enslaved people right before that 6-month period. And I just have to say, I find that disturbing. So I think that in all the research that I did for this presentation, that one thing stood out the most.
Thank you. And here is another question. Oh, this one's also for Joe.
I saw
this
that
question
one.
is, the Revere engraving looked as though he used paint in the image. Can you say anything about that?
So the quick answer is no. I would have to do a little bit more research. I think we know who the colorist was. I'm not sure. I'd have to dig a little bit to find out. She also said, I think in her comment, that it looked like there was old paint being used. Obviously, the paint was old now. It was painted in 1770, so a lot of time has elapsed since then. So, yeah, I can't really. I would have to do additional research to find out if we know who the colorist was, and it could be that it may actually be on the engraving itself, but I'm not sure. I would have to find out.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about prints is how many hands were really involved in making them a physical object. Because often you would have an artist who would draw the picture, and then it would have to be transferred to a plate, and then someone would have to etch it into the plate, and then of course someone would print it on a press. And so they were really complex, are complex objects, especially if there's any additional hand coloring.
The misunderstanding is that just because it's printed, it is not unique. And every single print is unique in its own way. And of course, one of the ways is because each print is colored either by a different person or multiple people. We don't know. Our specific print, and I didn't get into the details, and there are so many levels of information beyond what I talked about. But one of them is, if you looked at the print, there's a clock on the top left, and that is the time when the massacre took place. And ours, I think is it 10:30 or the 10:20, but it's the more accurate time when the incident took place. Whereas the first state, the first printing that Paul Revere did, it was at a different time, which was the incorrect time. So Revere changed it to be more accurate. So I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty and to the weeds, but there's just so many things that one can say. Good question.
We are going to have another chance for a good question, because here's another question about the prints. These are really wonderful questions. Thank you, everyone who's contributing. The Revere etchings seem more like news reporting than artwork. Is that an accurate view?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so I guess my message when I was doing my talk was that it was extremely biased. So we have the court reportings. Everything that happened on that day at that time is documented in court reportings, which we have at the Free Library and that you can read. And that is the objective. That's basically what happened. Of course, you have news reportings. In addition to that, you have a lot of other documentation. It is clear, and I hope that's what I showed in my presentation, that what Paul Revere did was definitely a form of propaganda. That it was showing that the British military were firing on innocent civilians, and we know, yes, they did fire. Yes, people were killed, but we know that that is not an accurate depiction. But I think it goes to the point, and this is a really common question that we get with high school students, for example. The moment they see that there's any sort of bias, that there is a point of view in something that is being reported, they automatically think it's incorrect. So the message that, as a librarian, that I want to get across is just because there is bias in something, and there's bias in everything that's in all reportings, in all depictions, you can't get rid of bias. It's baked into it, that you can't by default discount it and eliminate that. So our jobs as people, as being critical information gatherers, is to look at look at the engraving, look at the reports, look at the court documents, and by comparing everything that happened at that moment in time, then hopefully we can get it at what exactly happened during the Boston massacre. So sorry for a long-winded answer, but that's a really good question that deserves a lot of attention today, given the fact that that we really do have to look at the truth in media. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Caitlin, I see one comment in the chat. There just comments that there was bicentennial wagon trains that crossed the country and ended in Valley Forge, and we did have clippings about the wagon trains, and I took some pictures of them, but there's just too much to include. However, I would like to say that I was at the bicentennial wagon train in Valley Forge when I was 4 years old, and I got lost at the bicentennial wagon train in Valley Forge. And I have a photo of myself there too. But
presentation.
I chopped so much. I do have the photo. Maybe I'll post it to my Instagram.
It looks like we've answered all of your existing questions, but I really want to thank everyone for coming out here to this sort of virtual environment. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I really want to thank my co-presenters, Laura and Joe, for creating such a thoughtful and I think meaningful way to do a Welcome America right now when so much about America may seem unwelcoming. And I really want to re-extend the invitation to all of you to reach out to us via social media or via email. And then hopefully one day we can see you in person again, but we really are here to help you and help make these materials and these objects accessible to you. So I'll say thank you. And then I think I'm going to log us off. All right.
All right.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.